Yakuza 3 is a bit of a black sheep in the Yakuza community. It's not always been. When it first came out, it was a massive step up from the games that came before it, especially since in the West we never got the actual first PS3 Yakuza game, being a game called Kenzan, so for all 4 Western fans at the time, I'm sure they would have fallen in love with Yakuza 3. But as time moved on, the developers were constantly improving their own skills and abilities, and in turn were constantly improving the series. The quality of Yakuza 3 has never changed, but comparatively it has declined thanks to the more recent games just having so many graphical or mechanical improvements. One day though, hope raised from the depths of despair in the form of Yakuza Kiwami, being the first remake of the series. It had the exact same story and script of the original Yakuza 1, but with gameplay copied directly from the game released prior, being Yakuza 0. Then, a couple of years later, Yakuza Kiwami 2 appeared, with the story and script of Yakuza 2, but with gameplay copied from its prior game of Yakuza 6. And ever since then, the idea of Yakuza Kiwami 3 has been on every gamer's mind. Well, sort of. You see, they ended up doing Yakuza 3 Remastered, as well as the other 2 mainline releases that were previously locked to the PS3 of Yakuza 4 and 5. With Yakuza 3 now on all modern platforms, besides any Nintendo consoles, maybe a Kiwami 3 was less likely. There was no longer a need to save it from being locked to older hardware, like how Yakuza 1 and 2 were locked to the PS2, but Yakuza 1 and 2 did get the remastered treatment in the form of Yakuza 1 and 2 HD. It was a game exclusive to Japan, however, and it was only available on the PS3 and Wii U for some reason. Despite that though, it sort of means that even though Yakuza 1 and 2 got remasters that chucked them onto the next generation, they still eventually got remakes, and although it never came to PS3 in the West, Kiwami was indeed available on PS3. Perhaps not all hope is lost for Kiwami 3 then, except hope was lost once again. After the remake of another Japanese exclusive game, being a game called Ishin, the developers more or less said, "We're done with looking backwards, so stop asking for remakes or we'll slap you." You'll never guess what happens next though. Yep. Hope was found yet again. Recently, the devs have basically been saying that Kiwami 3 may not actually be out of the question. It likely won't be anytime soon, but given that Gaiden took the developers about half a year to make, maybe they'll just whip up a Kiwami 3 in a year and we'll see it at the end of 2025. But why has there been such desperate hope for a remake of this game? Well, like I said, Yakuza 3 is a black sheep. One reason for that is that it's the oldest as far as the modern Yakuza games are concerned, and it suffers from many unfavourable things. But at the same time, it benefits from many great things and is loved by more than just the 4 people in the West who played it when it released. But to be quite blunt, if you can't criticise something you love, you don't love it at all. For example, I love Lost Judgment more than any other Yakuza game still to this very day, but I can tell you easily right off the top of my head that the biggest flaw with that game is that I'm not playing it right now. In all seriousness, even if you love the game to no end, you should be able to understand people's desire to want this game to get a second chance. In my opinion, I think that the best thing about Yakuza 3 is its incredible charm. Looking back on the series, it seems like it was when they first started just having fun with the games. The story's much more lighthearted than previous entries, because even though it has some very sad moments, that sadness is drawn from how happy the game can make you feel. The characters are incredibly lovable, and even though I think gameplay-wise the orphanage kids are annoying as hell, those kids allowed for the protagonist Kiryu to open his heart and smile more. A lot of the elements in gameplay are less serious too, with what feels like an overall more silly approach to many hit actions and action sequences. The whole game, especially in comparison to Yakuza 1 and 2, was just overall more joyous. But there are many things about the game that are quite bad. This time, it's not just in comparison to the more modern Yakuza games, but in comparison to a lot of modern video games and games that came out around the same time as Yakuza 3. The first thing I'll get out of the way is the thing that everyone complains about with the game. The gameplay. No, I'm not just going to say the enemies block too much and be done with it, because realistically it's much more than that. In comparison to the modern Yakuza games, heat generation is arse, there's no separate equipment tab, so gear takes up your already limited inventory, too few attacks can break guards, and when a guard is broken they can just immediately re-guard. The heavy enemies are stupid because you just straight up can't grab them. Bosses take way too long to kill, and it's purely because they have too much health, so it's a lot of doing the same thing over and over again, especially the first fight against Tamashiro, as you will have no cool abilities to use. Then even when you do get the cool abilities, there are so few compared to later games that you end up just doing the same thing in every single fight. Even when the defenders get angry at people for doing the same combos over and over again, they'll show you how to properly play the game, and guess what? They'll just do the same thing over and over. But beyond the combat, you can't sprint, so you feel very slow. The remastered version screwed up holding directly up on an analog stick, so you wiggle around a bunch, although I don't remember if that's just a PC problem or not. The taxis are a joke because they're so far away from everything and there's so few in such shit spots, which makes me wonder why they did that, because I know the world isn't that big, but you would have thought at least someone on the team played Oblivion or something and went, oh, that's a good idea, you know. Anyway, you can't save anywhere and have to use the phone booths, which is something they utilise up until Yakuza 6, but in 3 they were also placed around it quite bad locations, which also meant that item storage was a pain in the ass thanks to, again, your very limited inventory. And I've honestly only scratched the surface with the gameplay problems with Yakuza 3, but for now I'll move on to probably my biggest reason as to why I want a Kiwami 3, and that's that Yakuza 3 is fucking horribly ugly. Part of that is definitely due to the year it came out and the hardware it was on, but most of it is due to just kind of shit direction, I guess. Kiryu looks like he's made of rocks. A lot of the NPCs have incredibly low detailed faces. Everybody's body proportions are fucked. Many animations, especially for the kids walking around, are just so wrong. The lighting is pretty damn bland and boring, and the whole look of the game just feels low budget and low quality. Just for some comparison, even though they don't look jaw-droppingly beautiful either, some games that released on the PS3 around the same time include GTA 4, Skate 2, Killzone 2, Resident Evil 5, Arkham Asylum, Uncharted 2, Tekken 6, Ratchet & Clank: A Crack in Time, Modern Warfare 2, Assassin's Creed 2, and they all came out later, but just to make a point, Yakuza 5, Ishin 0, and Kiwami all released on the PS3 as well. But then just like the rest of the series, the animations in the cutscenes as well as all the storyboarding and whatever of them was really good. Even a boring cutscene is still entertaining in presentation alone. But some animations that aren't that good, or to me at least they're just directed weirdly, are the heat actions. But it's not the animation quality, it's again just how it's presented, and we know that the quality is not a problem, which is why still to this day they're using heat actions from the PS2 games. The heat actions, regardless of whether or not they're new to 3 or were from 1, 2 or Kenzan, have a sort of weird inconsistency to them. There's stuff like the wrestling move where Kiryu throws a guy behind him onto another guy, which looked good back then and still does now, hence why they still use it. But then there's just stuff like the multi-person rush, where Kiryu teleports around that just tonally is so much different. I know it's a revelation heat action, and those can intentionally be humorous, but you can still make something funny look cool. A good thing with heat actions as they went on is that they still had silly ones, but they massively emphasized the skill and power of whoever was doing them, and to top it all off, they're all beautifully animated. Kiryu and Yagami are both powerful and technical, then Kaito swings all of his weight into everything with reckless abandon, Shinada just fumbles around with whatever feels natural, Saejima slams his raw strength into people, Akiyama finesses his opponents with like acrobatics and shit. They sell an idea of what the character's like that's consistent with their other heat actions as well as with the character's personality and gameplay and all that. But then Yakuza 3 has some silly ones that aren't even meant to look silly. It's not a heat action and I know it's super iconic, but why did Kiryu and Mine do that in their intro, for example? I've done a few videos where I go and record heat actions from many of the games, but Yakuza 3 and to a lesser extent 4's style to heat actions is quite ugly. I really just do not like how they're handled. I don't know whether this was a Yakuza 3 remastered thing or was present in the original 2, but the lack of facial animations, the weak sound effects, and a lot of the limp-wristedness of so many of the attacks just means that none of the heat actions from back then have the same impact as the ones they have today. The transitions between gameplay, heat action, back to gameplay 2 are all just awkward and weird. There's no real fades or anything, it just jump cuts between stuff. The transitions are something that they honestly always struggled with until Yakuza 6, because after a heat action, a lot of the time the game will just teleport you to a different spot than where you were at the end of the heat action. But at least Yakuza 5 introduced the wind-up animations for heat actions. Eventually those were scrapped, but just small things like the minimap fading away and fading back in, and the camera slowly going back to player control all just makes the heat actions feel less like you hit play on a video that would just end suddenly. But a perfect example, I think, to show the lack of impact that the Yakuza 3 hit actions is one called Essence of Ass Crush, in later games at least. But in Yakuza 3, it is so laughably weak. Kiryu gently pushes an enemy into a bit of metal and the enemy starts freaking the hell out. Meanwhile, Kiryu's just like, oh, sorry dude, are you okay? Compare that to later games where Kiryu winds them up, gives them time to realize that they are fucked! And now they're never going to walk properly ever again. Sound effects again. In Yakuza 3, it's like a weak slap, but here in Kiwami and 0, it's like bro's been obliterated, and you can't even make the unrealistic argument because Yakuza 3s are equally unrealistic. I mean, a game like Tekken 8's got the right idea by having every hit sound effect basically being a 50 cal going off in your ear. Later Yakuza games do that too, with a lot of bassy, crushing sounds that sound like you've slammed someone through a stone wall even though you've just punched them on the ground. But what about the one where Kiryu throws a guy off a bridge or ledge? Having him flip 700 times is a visually appealing thing, but Kiryu barely puts in enough strength to make him rotate like 10 degrees. If you're gonna try and sell Kiryu's strength, make him freaking throw the guy to another planet, not just gently glide his hands at a stupid angle. But again though, you can definitely tell that over time they learned their lessons. That's why later games have way better heat actions than other action sequences. How they were stylized was just a lack of experience more than anything. They had ideas in their head but weren't exactly sure how to actually do them. The silly ones are intentionally silly, but as with every single bad thing in Yakuza 3, you are an idiot if you think the weird look to most of the combat animations was intentional. Because if it was intentional, then why did they constantly change and improve things? How did we we go from Yakuza 3's heat actions and action sequences to Gaiden's. When do you ever hear people criticize the gameplay of Yakuza 4 in the same way they criticize 3's? That's right. They don't, because 3 had a lot of mistakes, a lot of decisions that they very obviously later regretted, a lot of teething problems. It was their 4th game, second on the PS3, and they were still struggling to get the visual direction they all very clearly wanted. I can guarantee you if you went back in time to the Sega office when they were making Kenzan or 3 and showed them Yakuza 0 and Kiwami on PS3, or even Yakuza 5, and said to them, "This is a PS3 game. Is this what you want?" They all collectively would say, "Hell yeah." And in the exact same way, if you showed them Infinite Wealth and Gaiden when they were making Ishin or 0 and said, "This game is also on PS4, they'd ask themselves what the hell they were doing messing around with this shit, because that's how they have always wanted their games to look. Because here's the thing, Yakuza 3 is like that one ugly friend in your friend group, who even though you'd much rather hang out with everyone else, you'd feel a hole in your heart if he was ever gone. His face was horribly disfigured at birth or something, his hair always looks horrible, his eyes barely work so he squints at literally everything, he's incredibly autistic so he can't hold a conversation, he's never had a girlfriend, and he's really annoying about that YouTube channel of his where he just talks about those stupid Yakuza games from all the memes on Reddit. But he's hilarious, he's really good at Titanfall 2, and there's probably something else good about him, but I just can't think about it right now. He's one of the boys, and you're fine with him being who he is. But if ever there was a chance to see him change, to see him succeed, to see him finally start wearing nice clothes and doing something with his fucking stupid hair, you and everyone else who knows him would love to see him shine. There are many great reasons to want a Kiwami 3, and for a lot of people, it means that they get to experience the great things from Yakuza 3 without having to play Yakuza 3. Imagine this, but it looked a bit more like this. But instead of the lighting looking like this, it looked a little more like this. All of the games have always made worlds that are very enjoyable to look at, but with modern technology and skill sets, they could make Ryukyu go from lovely to amazing. And speaking of, many people really like the soundtrack for Yakuza 3. If I'm to be honest, I'm not one of those many people because a lot of the fights just ruin the themes for me. But still, Kiwami 3 means that the current team of composers get to breathe new life into long-forgotten or beloved songs. They do replace the originals in-game, but of course those original songs still exist, like how you can still listen to the Yakuza 1 and 2 soundtracks. It might have a couple of the same problems that Kiwami 2 faced with its soundtrack, being that a few of the songs Sega legally can't remake without forking over money to people that don't work for them. Long story, but the new original songs in Kiwami 2 were all bloody phenomenal. Although of course, we still have a large amount of completely brain-dead morons who will look you dead in the eye and tell you that a song like Break Off is mid. Don't listen to those people. Instead, listen to your heart, because it knows for a fact that a Chihiro Aoki remix of Fly would literally change the world forever. We'd probably also get a Majima theme that doesn't have frogs in it. Probably. Another great thing will be the plethora of quality of life improvements over the original. They'll hold us gently in a soft, comfortable embrace and make us all forget the woes of Yakuza 3's complete lack of quality of life. Running around without being able to sprint or ride around on the Segway or skateboard is just repetitive stuff that can and should be eliminated. I get that in a video game you don't want to cut out the challenge because instant gratification ruins the whole purpose of what you're trying to do and all that, but when it's just moving around it becomes incredibly boring. There's a reason why modern games have way better fast travel methods, and it's not TikTok brain rot, it's just that when I'm running down the same street for the 8th time in a single play session, I'm gonna start getting either pissed off or bored. I mean, in a more real life setting, it's why at a gym the weights are all easily accessible. The fun part is working out, but if the weights were locked behind some shelf that has a lock with a 30-second timer on it before you can open it every single time you want to pick up or put back a weight, you don't want to bother doing that shit every time. Because you can't be stuffed getting the weights out, you'll either piss off the staff for leaving your weights on the ground, or you just don't work out. And because you're not working out, you wonder what the hell is the point of even going to the gym. In Yakuza 3's case, you want to progress the story or get to the next major fight, but having to run around in circles every time at such a slow pace is just so boring. And if you could fast travel, you would. But you can fast travel in Yakuza 3, I hear you say. But you clearly forgot that the taxis suck major cock. You cut the bullshit out of the game, it's a lot more enjoyable. That's all I'm saying. You want to know how willing I am to go stuff around with optimizing my jobs and weapons and infinite wealth, even if it takes me literally like half an hour? Very. And that's because I can teleport at the bush of 3 buttons to the spot I want to go to, and it's all plainly laid out for me to very quickly do. If it wasn't, I'd never bother running all the way back just to run all the way back again. And again, this isn't some ADHD short attention span thing, but when I'm having fun playing the game, I don't want to stop to do things that are not fun. And as I've said in like 700 videos in the past, if I'm not having fun, I will do something else. like play Lost Judgment, for example. I am significantly more willing to play a 10-hour game twice than play a 20-hour game once. And I'm not opposed to a long game. I love a good long 80-hour journey, as long as it's actually good, of course. But something like Gaiden was significantly shorter than Infinite Wealth. And although I still loved Infinite Wealth, there was substantially less time between all of the fun bits of Gaiden. Not being forced to run to a save point or a taxi, as well as the option to skip all cutscenes of any kind, are great for reducing potential boredom for any player, but it's especially good for someone doing their second playthrough or someone like me who already knows what happens in Yakuza 3. And if I only get to do the fun bits of the game, I'm going to come out the other end of the tunnel blinded by the glorious light of the fun I just had. Another improvement or benefit of Kiwami 3 goes without saying, being the combat. Or at least it should go without saying, because if it plays at all like Gaiden or Lost Judgment, two games where the gameplay is leaps and bounds better than anything that came before them, then Kiwami 3's combat would go hard. If we're lucky, we'd get to play around with more fighting styles, as the developers clearly understand how good the mechanic is. Perhaps there'll be some original ones, or perhaps they'll try to add a bit of continuity to Yakuza 0 and Kiwami by just giving you Kiryu's 3 iconic Yakuza 0 styles, plus Gaiden's dragon style. That would just be so sexy. But then the last thing for the players, which isn't a guarantee but is definitely a hope, is that the developers have the option to create additional content. My hope is that they do something like the Majima saga from Kiwami 2 again, but instead of Majima they could do something truly unique and let us play as Mine, or even give us the chance to play as Akiyama. By playing as Mine, we get to play as a fan favorite character who has a fan favorite fighting style, and we get to know him a little more. Or if it was Akiyama, we can learn a bit more about his life before the events of Yakuza 4, which could then very easily lead into the story of Yakuza 4. Again, those are just hopes, but those probably will never happen if we never get a Kiwami 3. And now the final thing, which is actually for RGG Studio themselves. The developers who worked on Yakuza 3 that are still working on the games, as well as all of those who started working on the games after Yakuza 3, get a second chance at making Yakuza 3 again. In doing this, they can take out all of the bad and surround all of the good of Yakuza 3 with just more good stuff. I'll tell you now that the developers would probably love to go back and basically rewrite history. They could finally make the game that I'm sure back then they could have only dreamed of. And it won't outright replace anything. If you love Yakuza 3 that much, you'll know you can still listen to all the music, and if you have physical copies, you can still play the game. Kiwami 3 would also likely still not replace Yakuza 3 Remastered. I don't remember if Ishin Kiwami replaced the original Ishin on Japanese digital stores, but if it did, it sort of makes sense given how they were both on PS4. But then something like Judgment, which was only available on PS4, was not replaced by Judgment Remastered, which was on Xbox Series, PS5 and PC. And although it's Atlus and not directly Sega, Persona 3 Reload didn't replace Persona 3 Portable, and you can still buy it and play it. So there's not too much concern for a Kiwami 3 replacing Yakuza 3 Remastered, in my opinion. And to those who think that people only want a Kiwami 3 because they think Yakuza 3 is bad, you could easily do a Yakuza 0 Kiwami, and I'm sure even die-hard fans of Yakuza 0 would love it. In fact, if that's what the very special announcement's going to be in September, let me say no, actually, I can't really put into words how good a Yakuza 0 Kiwami would be. So let me just try and show it to you, I guess. What it would be like if Yokoyama steps up onto a little stage and says, "Hey guys, Yakuza 0. Now again, the world wants a Yakuza 3 Kiwami because Yakuza 3 could be better. As with all products of humanity, there is always room for improvement. And I think it's unfair to leave Yakuza 3 in the dirt where it lays buried underneath the crushing weight of the later games. So you know what? If you want to experience a truly underappreciated game with a beautiful story that focuses on friendship and bonds between loved ones, a game with characters so believable and lovable that you wish you could meet them in real life, a game with dialogue so well crafted that it would make Shakespeare jealous, a game with misunderstood gameplay that a shitload of people on the internet say is just a button masher when you know 100% that it bloody well isn't. A game that constantly gets compared to games in the series that came both before and after it, with those comparisons often being negative despite the game being its own unique and glorious experience. A game that's more than just the hot men and the dog. A game with visuals that are truly stunning beyond what any words could describe. A game with some of the most action-packed and fun boss fights you'll ever experience. A game that got snubbed by Jeff Keighley for Game of the Year when it came out. A game with a soundtrack so awesome that you wonder why anyone even bothers to talk about amateurs like Mozart and Beethoven. A game that truly deserves the love and praise of everyone on the planet. If you, dear viewer, liked the video, you should like and subscribe. But if you want to play an amazing game, a game so good that it doesn't need a re-release or a remake, actually no. I guess it doesn't really need a remake because it only came out last year anyway, and that's because I'm very obviously talking about Final Fantasy XVI! Get that game because Yakuza 3 sucks dick!